I moved into the cul-de-sac the way people step into cold water, slowly, braced for a shock, hoping the bite would pass. The house was small but square, with a porch deep enough to sit under summer rain. The first night, I walked the perimeter with my service dog at my side, letting him catalog every scent, every creak of fence and whisper of hedge. He wore his vest with the quiet professionalism that made strangers stand a little taller when he passed. I had learned to read his signals the way a pilot reads instruments, ears tilting for distant thunder, a subtle lean when my heart rate climbed, a nose nudge that meant I was drifting into a place I no longer wanted to visit. His training was not decoration. It was how I stayed safely in the present. The neighborhood looked like a brochure for tidy dreams, roses trained to climb trellises, garages painted to match shutters, driveways rinsed and edged like hospital bedsheets. The HOA's rulebook arrived in a crisp binder that smelled vaguely of printer ink and hairspray, and the welcome note was signed by a president whose name sounded like it belonged engraved on a crystal award. I skimmed the table of contents and filed it on a shelf, the way you file most things you hope you won't need. For a week, the place felt peaceful. Morning coffee, late walks, a schedule measured by sunlight and the dog's steady clock. Then the first notice arrived, taped to the front door like a summons. The letterhead was heavy with authority, the language lighter on empathy. It claimed my dog was an unauthorized pet, cited a section of the rules that lumped parrots, pythons, and shepherds into one tidy box, and announced a fine schedule that rose like a staircase to nowhere. I stood on the porch and felt the old static in my limbs. The vest on the hook by the door seemed to stare back at me, red and reflective, proof that this wasn't a hobby or a preference. It was medical equipment with a heartbeat. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. People mix up service animals with pets all the time, and most of them listen once you spell out the difference. I gathered documentation with the practiced calm of a medic laying out gauze, physician's letter, training certificates, a brief note summarizing tasks performed. I copied the relevant sections of federal law and the state provisions that matched them like overlapping stencils. My packet was neat, respectful, complete, and it went into the HOA's slot under the clubhouse door with the confidence of truth that doesn't need to shout. By the weekend, 2 more notices arrived. One said the board had reviewed my materials and declined my request for accommodation because dogs were disruptive to the community aesthetic. Another escalated the fines and threatened lien action with the clinical chill of a thermometer dipped in winter water. The words final warning appeared twice as if repetition could make them heavier. I walked the dog at dawn to stay ahead of the watchers, curtains that moved like stage props, eyes that flinched away when I met them. He paced me with the patience of a surgeon scrubbed in and waiting, and when my palms began to sweat, he pressed against my leg until the ground stopped pitching. I mapped the clubhouse hours and decided to attend the next meeting. I imagined tables, a pitcher of water, a few residents airing lawn grievances with neighborly exasperation. Instead, I entered a theater of control where rules were thrown like darts and complaints were currency. The president spoke with a polished certainty that could have sold umbrellas in a desert. The word policy was rolled across the room like a bowling ball aimed at pins in the shape of my dog. When I referenced the law, eyes slid past mine as if I were speaking a language issued to me overseas and never translated on my return. The room smelled faintly of coffee and hairspray and something older that clings to places where power is habit. I left with no resolution and a stack of forms that felt like a dare. The dog sat in the passenger seat on the drive home, head low, tracking my breathing the way he always did when the world tightened. I parked in the driveway and watched my porch for a long time, a soldier studying terrain he knows will be crossed. The second I stepped out, a neighbor across the street pretended to check her mail, then scrolled her phone with the theatrical disinterest of someone filming in her mind. On Monday, the first fine hit my inbox with the tidy precision of a calendar alert. I paid nothing and sent a careful, complete appeal. Another fine arrived, then another, like the drumbeat of a march. At night, I rehearsed what calm sounded like and how to anchor myself when the anger rose. The dog nudged my knee, leaned in, breathed me back from the place the notices wanted me to go. On the porch, a new letter fluttered in the wind, tape at one corner giving up the fight. I read it under the porch light's humming halo and understood the next part of the story had begun. Whether I liked it or not, the letter invited me to a compliance hearing where the Board would determine appropriate sanctions. It was dressed in bureaucratic phrases that tried to hide the trembling core of it, a demand that I choose between my safety and their comfort. I ran my thumb over the crease in the paper until it left a ridge on my skin. The dog rested his chin on my boot, patient as always. The porch light buzzed. Moths tapped the glass, and behind the hum I could hear the click of a gavel in a room that wasn't ready for the law it was about to meet. The compliance hearing took place in a clubhouse that tried to pretend it was a courthouse. A flag stood in the corner, wilting under fluorescent lights. Folding chairs lined up like rows of teeth, and a long table collected lanyards, clipboards, and the quiet smugness of people who mistake proximity to power for power itself. The board gathered with the air of hosts waiting for a guest of honor who had already offended them by arriving. I wore a steady expression I had practiced in mirrors and in worse places than this. My dog lay at my feet in a downstay that could have been cast in bronze. The opening felt rehearsed. Terms like decorum, aesthetic uniformity, and precedent scattered across the room like thumbtacks. They cited sections of their handbook the way amateurs quote scripture, locating certainty not in understanding but in confidence. When my turn came, I kept it simple. I delivered the facts like clean instruments on a sterile tray. I described the tasks my dog performs in clinical sentences. I summarized my medical documentation without inviting pity. I referenced federal and state law, specific clauses, and the concept that seemed to unsettle them most. Reasonable accommodation is not a favor. It is a legal requirement. They didn't argue the law directly. They walked around it, preferring the soft carpet of personal annoyance. A board member claimed she had heard barking at odd hours. Another fretted that a vest would invite copycats. A third suggested a leash color standard that sounded more superstition than regulation. Underneath it all ran a current of resentment, the kind that coils when someone believes rules are a mirror and refuses to see you in it. I listened without interrupting, not because they had earned the courtesy, but because patience is a weapon that cuts arguments cleanly in half. The hearing concluded with a decision they had written before I arrived. They denied the accommodation and ratcheted fines with a confidence that relied on fatigue. Most people fold when paper piles high and letters start to sound like the future clearing its throat. I had folded once in a different life and learned the cost. In the parking lot, I took a breath, watched my dog scan the horizon with the calm of a lighthouse, and began the next part of the plan. I documented everything. Dates, times, names, quotes paraphrased so precisely they felt like recordings. I kept my emails dry and exacting, trimmed of emotion as if emotion were a contaminant. I requested the appeals process in writing and identified the timeline that would force them to move or expose their stalling. I filed a complaint with the state's Fair Housing Agency, attaching the binder of proof that had grown fatter with every arrogant misstep. I spoke with an attorney whose voice carried the practice boredom of someone who has won the same fight in 100 different living rooms. Meanwhile, the neighborhood mood shifted from passive curiosity to curated hostility. Sidewalk conversations stopped when I approached, like radios going suddenly to static. Anonymous notes appeared on my windshield, typed on a machine that thought anonymity had a font. They suggested I move for harmony, and offered a list of communities where pets might be welcome. My dog, oblivious to theater, worked without complaint. When my breathing shortened, he anchored me. When alarms thudded in my head at 2 a.m., he performed the pattern that brought me back to shore. He was not disruptive. He was a quiet bridge to every ordinary morning I had reclaimed. The board escalated. They announced a pet audit, a phrase that sounded like satire until it landed on neighbors' doorsteps. They encouraged reports of unauthorized animals, deputizing gossip as policy. A few residents treated the invitation like a pastime. Others looked ashamed but participated anyway, as if compliance were a hazard suit that saved them from catching my trouble. During one walk, a security car rolled slowly beside me, recording video that would later be edited to imply menace in something mundane. A man and a dog, moving like tidewater, predictable and calm. I learned to calibrate my energy, saving it for the places where it mattered. Depositions, declarations, deadlines. The fair housing investigator opened a file and began to collect the pattern I had been tracing. A quilt of letters stitched with repeated violations and a small, mean pride in the stitching. The attorney explained the concept of retaliation, and how it often reveals itself like a bruise that blooms a day late. He described fees that attach like barnacles to the hulls of associations that insist on learning the law the expensive way. The board tried one more maneuver, a ballot mailed to residents, asking whether pets in common areas made them feel unsafe. They wrapped it in concern the way a spider wraps a fly, not for protection but to make feeding easier. I responded with another stack of law, explaining that rights are not subject to neighborhood plebiscites. The investigator added the ballot to the file like a new exhibit in a long museum of poor choices. On the morning the lien warning arrived, the sky had that particular washed-out color that makes everything look like a photograph taken from far away. The letter promised foreclosure if the totals were not paid by a date that sounded like a countdown. I made coffee and sat with my dog at my feet, the kitchen quiet except for the sound of a refrigerator that always seemed a beat away from silence. It was time to file in court. It was time to move the fight from a clubhouse to a place where the air carries a different voltage, where words are weighed in public and pretensions shrink under the glare. I pressed the last page of our complaint into a manila folder and felt something unclench in my chest. The file wasn't a weapon. It was a boundary. I had lived in places without working boundaries, where force stood in for law and luck masqueraded as mercy. This was not that place. The courthouse was 30 minutes away, and the drive there would take me past the clubhouse and the flag wilting in its corner, past the neighbor's hedge clipped to military precision, past the silent windows that had watched me long enough to believe they were mirrors. We left right after sunrise, the dog spotting birds as if ticking boxes in a quiet ledger. The engine hummed, the road unfurled, and somewhere between the first red light and the highway on-ramp, the story changed tense from present to pending. Filing suit did not feel triumphant. It felt like tightening laces before a long run you didn't want to take but knew you would finish. The clerk stamped our complaint with a sound like a gavel's cousin, less theatrical, more permanent. The case number sat on the page like coordinates. From there, everything turned technical. Service of process, deadlines mapped like supply routes, witness lists lined up like rations. The attorney explained that the earliest skirmishes often decide the entire campaign. We prepared accordingly. Discovery is a polite word for a very impolite mirror. The HOA had to produce emails, minutes, messages, and the casual remarks that people put in writing when they believe their audience is only the like-minded. Files arrived as PDFs with names that tried to dull their contents. Noise complaints, compiled PDF, pet policy discussion.docx, compliance notes, Q2-LSX. Inside, the tone shifted from clipped officialese to something closer to gossip over coffee. Board members speculated about my medical condition with the confidence of non-experts, discussed the optics of backing down, and referred to my dog as a precedent bomb that might blow up the uniformity they preferred to call peace. There were also the minutes, the kind that leave out just enough to look clean. Whole segments read like a magic trick where cards vanish mid-shuffle. The investigator requested raw recordings from meetings and received files with suspicious gaps. Audio artifacts shaped like erasures. Meanwhile, my own record grew heavier. I had video of the dog interrupting a night terror, bringing me back to a kitchen where light was once again just light and not a concussion of memory. I had letters from physicians who do not dramatize because they do not need to. The truth has its own volume. I had statements from neighbors who decided the rulebook meant less to them than the kind of quiet that can only come from conscience. The HOA responded with a counter-narrative about community, standards, and the dangers of erosion when one exception becomes two. They attached photos with time-stamped captions that tried to suggest disruption where none existed. A shot of us near the clubhouse with the words non-pet area circled in digital red. A still of my dog looking toward a child on a scooter described as intimidating posture. A close-up of a vest tag taken from a distance as if covert collection added legitimacy. It all had the stiffness of a false confession written for an audience of one. Retaliation continued like weather in the background. The board mailed reminders of fines as if the court filing were a rumor, not a reality. A newsletter blurb about rule breakers appeared 2 days after our lawsuit, written with just enough vagueness to avoid naming me and just enough specificity to point a neon arrow in my direction. The security car stopped beside my house longer than before, camera lens a black pupil that never blinked. I logged each instance without letting them colonize my head. The dog managed the physiological fallout the way he always had. A pressure here, a nudge there, the canine equivalent of someone placing a steadying hand on your shoulder amid a crowd. Mediation was scheduled like a formality, a step designed for people who can be nudged back to the table by convenience. We went anyway, not because I expected a transformation, but because process leaves a paper trail. The mediator wore the expression of a man who has seen every permutation of stubbornness and learned to survive by not playing favorites. The HOA's attorney reiterated their stance with the patience of someone sewing a button back onto a coat that will split again the second the wearer exhale. Our side offered a solution that was not even a compromise, merely the law in plain clothes. Recognize the service animal, zero the fines, update the policy to reflect reality, train the board to stop mistaking their preferences for statutes. The president of the board adopted a voice that people think sounds reasonable because it is slow. He spoke about fairness to residents who followed the rules for years, about the slippery slope of making one exception, about safety and liability and insurance premiums that exist mostly in the imagination until someone needs them. The mediator tilted his head the way people do when they're trying to decide whether to deploy a tool you don't know they own. He asked a few questions that circled around the phrase federal preemption. And for a moment I watched something flicker across the president's face, the indigestion that occurs when a big word collides with a small. Plan mediation ended without resolution. That failure helped more than surrender would have because it stripped the HOA's stance to its skeleton. There would be no reasonable path except the one the law already paved. More depositions followed. My responses were short, sober, and scrubbed free of the kind of autobiographical detail that makes good radio, but bad testimony. Their answers were longer and full of contradictions that sprouted like weeds after rain. One board member insisted that the no pets rule had been applied uniformly. Minutes revealed that a decorative rabbit had been blessed as therapeutic the prior spring. The court granted our motion to compel production of the missing audio segments. What arrived in place of clarity was a confession by absence, a statement that unrecoverable technical errors had erased portions of the recordings. The judge noted the pattern in a footnote. Patterns matter. They connect dots into a shape a jury can recognize without subtitles. When the HOA tried to speed up their lien process as leverage, the judge stayed enforcement with an order that read like a stern parent, reminding a teenager that car keys are a privilege, not a right. In the background, ordinary life kept happening because it has to. I mowed the lawn, hauled the bins to the curb, waved at the few neighbors who remembered how to wave. The dog's routines did not change. He braced me on stairs when 2 steps in my mind turned into 20. He woke me from cliff-edge dreams with a nudge that felt like being escorted back into the body you had temporarily abandoned. In the mirror, I looked like someone who had never wanted a fight and had learned to carry one anyway. Trial dates appeared on calendars. The attorney walked me through what to expect, how to sit, where to look, how to breathe when their version of me was presented like a character they'd rehearsed. I ironed a shirt and set it on a hanger like a promise to myself that I would not be turned into a cautionary tale for people who find comfort in minimizing what they do not understand. The night before opening statements, I stood on the porch and listened to the neighborhood play its usual evening symphony. Dogs, distant sprinklers, a car door soft as a sigh. For a brief minute, it sounded like a place that could be home. Then a new letter slid through the mail slot and landed on the floor like a punctuation mark. It was a final notice dressed up as concern, warning that if I persisted in weaponizing legal mechanisms, the association would have no choice but to pursue all available remedies. The phrase "all available" sat in the middle of the page like a dare. I turned off the porch light, gave my dog the signal to settle, and closed my eyes. Morning would come, and with it the room where the story would no longer be told in newsletters and notices, but in statements that had to survive questions. The courtroom was colder than any clubhouse and warmer than any barracks. It had the clean geometry of places built for judgment, lines that go where they are supposed to, surfaces that refuse clutter, a clock that moves in public. The judge entered with the gravity of someone who knows words can move money and people with the same efficiency. A small audience gathered, neighbors, board members, the curious, the bored. My dog lay beneath counsel table, invisible to anyone not looking for what steadiness feels like. Our case opened without theatrics. The attorney framed it as what it was, a straightforward violation dressed up in administrative language. He spoke about the purpose of accommodation, The difference between a pet and a service animal, the way civil rights laws operate in everyday places that are usually more interested in siding with convenience. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked for compliance, and he asked for consequences that would give future boards a reason to learn before fining. Evidence unrolled like a road with well-placed signs. Exhibits documented my requests, their denials, my appeals, their escalation, my complaint, their retaliation. The investigators' findings sat in a binder thick enough to make the table groan. The judge read with the neutral intensity of someone fitting each page into a lattice that would eventually hold a conclusion. When my turn came to testify, I stayed in the lane we had rehearsed. I described the dog's tasks the way a mechanic describes torque. I explained what happens in my body when a certain scent or sound scrapes the past into the present, and I detailed how the dog interrupts that spiral not with sentiment, but with trained behavior that short-circuits panic. The HOA presented its version next. Their attorney talked about consistency and protecting residents from a cascade of exceptions. He expressed concern for young children in common areas, as if safety were a blanket that only fit if it covered their fears and left my facts out in the cold. Board members took the stand and tried on gravitas like a suit one size too large. Some genuinely believed they were protecting something. Others, you could tell, were more in love with the posture of authority than with any particular outcome. When cross-examination exposed contradictions, special approvals for ornamental animals, minutes that didn't match testimony, a ballot that treated rights like a neighborhood, suggestion box, the room's energy, shifted the way air changes before rain. At one point, the HOA's counsel suggested my dog had caused fear among residents. That statement detonated gently under questioning. No incident reports, no actual complaints from residents willing to sign their names, only a handful of emails between board members designing fear in the abstract, using it as mortar to shore up a wall that kept collapsing under the weight of the law. The judge asked a few pointed questions about training requirements and federal definitions. Words that had been tossed around for months suddenly had to withstand proximity to precision. The final witness for our side was the fair housing investigator. She spoke with the even cadence of someone allergic to drama. She recited timelines, noted departures from lawful process, named instances where the HOA's behavior met the definition of retaliation. She did not exaggerate. She barely raised her voice, but she laid out a sequence that even the board's allies in the gallery could follow, with the kind of sinking feeling that precedes surrender. Closing arguments were shorter than I expected, possibly because there wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said carefully, and on the record. Our attorney asked for what the law allows: declaratory relief recognizing the violation, a permanent injunction preventing further interference, damages for the stress and costs imposed, and fees that would make education less optional for future boards. The HOA's counsel asked for reason, a word that had been stretched so thin over the months that it was transparent. The judge took the matter under advisement, which is the judicial version of a deep breath. The room exhaled with him. People gathered their impressions like coats. The board president's posture was still tall, but now it read as brittle. I left the courthouse into an afternoon that had chosen a gentler light. In the parking lot, I gave the dog a moment to sniff the hedge, to reset his catalog of scents from proceedings to ordinary life. On the drive home, the neighborhood's identical mailboxes looked less like a chorus and more like props built for a play that had just ended its last act. Waiting for a ruling is its own kind of endurance. The HOA tried two last measures of pressure: a community email claiming that outside forces were threatening our way of life, and a special meeting to discuss budget impacts from lawsuits. Filed those under exhibits of a different kind: public relations as defense mechanism. I adjusted my routines in small ways so I wouldn't start measuring time only by someone else's decision. Morning runs continued. Training refreshers with the dog continued. The habit of not letting other people's posture define my peace continued. The ruling arrived at 9:12 a.m. on a Tuesday, electronic and undeniable. I sat at the kitchen table as the words rendered line by line, the way truth sometimes needs a second to come into focus. The judge's order spanned pages, but the heart of it was plain. The HOA had violated the Fair Housing Act by denying a reasonable accommodation for a service animal. They had engaged in unlawful retaliation. They were enjoined from further interference. They owed damages and attorney's fees. They were to adopt and disseminate a compliant accommodation policy. Board members were to complete training within a set period. Fines and liens were void, and any record referencing them was to be corrected. The language was not angry. It did not need to be. Authority, when properly used, is quiet. I printed the order on paper that felt heavier than it weighed and placed it into a folder that had been waiting for this exact shape of relief. The dog watched me from his mat, ears relaxed, eyes soft in the way that says he understands movement more than meaning. Outside, sprinklers started on 3 lawns in unison. The clubhouse flag, as if receiving orders, lifted from its slouch. The story could have ended there with the court's ink still drying, but neighborhoods do not change on paper alone. There was still the matter of what life would look like when the gavel's echo faded, and the cul-de-sac remembered it had to share itself with the people it contained. The ruling did more than clear the fines. It rearranged the architecture of a place that had convinced itself rules were virtues, and exceptions were sins. The HOA posted the court's order to the community portal with a preface that sounded like they were announcing weather, not responsibility. A notice for a special training session followed, mandatory for board members and encouraged for residents. The binder of rules, once treated like sacred text, was updated with new pages that smelled of ink and reluctance. In the margins of daily life, small rituals changed first. The security patrol car stopped loitering in front of my house. Notes ceased appearing under wipers. The neighbor who once filmed me with the gleeful secrecy of a spy began watering her azaleas at a time that did not intersect with my walks. People who had been neutral drifted back toward normal greetings, a slow tide of nods and chin lifts. There were apologies, too, a few delivered in the careful language of people learning they can inhabit sentences like, "I was wrong," without dissolving. I accepted them without performing absolution. Forgiveness here was not the point. Functioning was. The Fair Housing Agency monitored compliance with the court's order as if the association were a student on a timed exam. Policies were rewritten in real language instead of word salad. A form appeared for accommodation requests that did not demand medical confessions. A board liaison was assigned not because I needed one, but because future residents might. The attorney sent a final invoice to the HOA's insurer, a sum that would wag its finger every time a meeting agenda tempted them to try arrogance again. The president stepped down with a letter that thanked the community for the opportunity to serve and thanked no one for the opportunity to learn. For my part, life resumed as something other than opposition. The dog and I reclaimed our roots, added new ones, varied the time so the day wouldn't fossilize into patterns broken only by court filings. I rejoined a quiet list of routines that feel like health. Laundry folded the day it's washed, trash bins returned promptly from the curb, a book finished without checking my email between chapters. The dog's vest remained on its hook except when needed, which is to say often enough to be called ordinary. When rain came, we shelter-trained, listening to the sound on the roof as if it were a metronome for breath. But consequences ripple outward, and not all of them are gentle. The HOA's budget meeting became an exercise in public accounting. Insurance premiums had adjusted in direct proportion to the board's stubbornness, and assessments would rise by an amount that made even the previously smug check their arithmetic. Some residents looked at me as if I had authored those numbers personally. I did not. Cause and effect had already been written by actions taken before the lawsuit. Still, resentment is a plant that grows even in poor soil. I learned to recognize it and not feed it. Change is fragile where pride has been injured. A new board, installed by a quorum that had finally learned quorum mattered, began to speak in a different register. They scheduled listening sessions and actually listened. They sought legal advice before drafting letters. They revisited other policies that had calcified into opportunities for power theater, paint shades, holiday decorations, even the perennial obsession with lawn height that made grown adults argue about centimeters, as if they were values. There was pushback, always from corners where authority felt like identity. But the court order sat behind every agenda like a guardian whose presence required no announcement. Weeks later, an email appeared in the community inbox inviting residents to a Neighbors and Working Dogs open house at the clubhouse lawn. The flyer featured a collage of dogs in vests and a bullet list about the difference between service animals, emotional support animals, and pets. It was corny and sincere and exactly the sort of thing that would have been mocked months prior. I attended because living in a place means participating in the pitches you would not have thrown yourself. The dog performed a few basic tasks for those who asked with curiosity instead of challenge. Children watched with the pure attention that adults unlearn when they begin to prefer opinions to understanding. For 20 minutes, the lawn felt like a community and not a theater. The last official act of compliance arrived in the mail, a letter confirming that the association had adopted a fair housing policy, trained its board, updated its forms, voided fines and liens, and corrected my account ledger to reflect the truth. 0 owed, 0 past due. It was printed on letterhead I had come to associate with harm. Seeing it used to repair rather than injure felt like watching a familiar door open into a room you'd never been allowed to enter. I filed it in the cabinet labeled Keep and closed the drawer softly so the moment would not rattle. There were still small indignities that didn't vanish just because the court had spoken. A neighbor moved away and told someone at a yard sale that the community had gone soft. Another posted on a private social media group about outsiders changing everything, as if I had parachuted into a place that did not already share a flag with the Constitution that governs us all. Those notes drifted toward me, carried by the same breeze that once delivered notices to my door. I let them pass through. The dog and I had other things to do, like live. At dusk one evening, as sprinklers arced across lawns that no longer felt like borders, I noticed the clubhouse flag lifted, not in salute to anyone in particular, but because the wind had woken. Somewhere behind me a screen door clicked, the universal sound of domesticity and truce. The dog leaned into my leg not because I needed anchoring in that moment, but because habit is comfort. The neighborhood had not become a utopia. It had merely become a place where rules served people rather than the reverse. That was enough to call it progress. Still, the story had one scene left to play, and it would take place not in a courtroom or on a lawn, but in the small space where a letter meets a signature and a policy becomes culture. The new board scheduled its first annual meeting since the ruling. On the agenda was an item that would set the tone for years. A resolution to codify accountability, so that future arrogance could not hide behind ambiguity. I planned to attend not to speak but to witness, not as a plaintiff but as a neighbor. The annual meeting filled the clubhouse in a way the compliance hearing never had. People arrived with folding chairs and measured expectations. The new board took their places with the posture of volunteers who understood that service is not a stage. On the wall, a printed copy of the court's injunction hung in a simple frame, not like a trophy but like a fire extinguisher. Visible, necessary, hopefully never needed. My dog settled under my chair, curated and visible as always. The agenda began with routine matters. Minutes approved, budgets discussed, landscaping contracts negotiated with the seriousness of federal procurement. Then the chair introduced the resolution that would become the HOA's new spine. It was not dramatic. It simply bound the association to a process that valued law over personality, clear accommodation procedures, timelines that could not be twisted into weapons, required consultation with counsel before enforcement, a prohibition on retaliation with examples plain enough to survive turnover and memory. The language was specific the way safety instructions are specific, because ambiguity is the enemy of accountability. Residents spoke in favor, some with the relief of people who had felt discomfort and not known how to name it. A few opposed, their arguments more nostalgic than legal. A yearning for a past where rules could be used to prune difference until uniformity felt like comfort. The vote was not close. The resolution passed with a thump of consensus that sounded like a lid closing on an old box. The chair banged the gavel lightly and moved on to holiday decoration guidelines, and for the first time since I'd moved in, a gavel sounded like punctuation rather than threat. After adjournment, small clusters formed like constellations. People compared notes on painters and tree trimmers and the eternal question of whether a cul-de-sac can be both quiet and alive. The board members shook hands without performing absolution. The fair housing investigator, there as an observer, nodded once in my direction, professional and distant, as if checking an item off a list that mattered precisely because it would never be publicly celebrated. The president who had presided over the violations was absent, his name consigned to minutes and memory. Leadership had changed because accountability had made it necessary, not because luck had delivered kindness. I walked home along the route I had mapped in the old days to avoid certain eyes. Now it was simply the shortest path. The dog trotted beside me, catching whiffs of barbecue and mulch, the ordinary perfume of shared geography. We paused at the corner where the security car once idled, the asphalt patched where oil had pooled. The only camera lens now was the sky, blue and incurious. I realized that winning had not felt like triumph, because the end of unnecessary struggle is not triumph. It is the restoration of something that should never have been missing. Back in the house, I took the framed order off the shelf where I had kept it visible as a reminder, and placed it in the cabinet with documents you hope your heirs never need to read. I hung the dog's vest on its hook and felt that small click in the brain when a symbol returns to being an object. On the fridge, a grocery list had replaced a litigation timeline. It read like a wardrobe change: bread, oranges, batteries, dog treats. I added coffee to the bottom because I finally felt like buying beans for mornings rather than fuel for watching the inbox. What lingers after conflict is not always bitterness. Sometimes it is craft, skills you didn't expect to acquire, like reading a policy for trapdoors, hearing the tone that reveals the difference between authority and performance, knowing how to hold your ground without turning the ground into a battleground. I kept those and let the rest go. The dog, who had carried me through the maze with professionalism that deserved a medal, wrestled a squeaky toy with the same intensity he brings to breaking a panic loop. His reward was the same either way: a job done, a nap won. The next morning, a new family moved into the house 2 doors down. A small girl stood on the lawn, watching a monarch butterfly fight a headwind. Her mother held a leash attached to a dog with a working vest and a gait that said he took his role seriously. I felt the dog at my side notice before I did and saw his ears tilt in recognition, not of species but of purpose. The mother glanced over, uncertain the way people are when they are new and carrying something fragile that looks like confidence but is closer to hope. I raised a hand in a small wave that asked nothing and promised only neighborliness. She lifted her hand back, grateful in the modest way gratitude looks when it is tired. No dialogue passed between us, only acknowledgement, which is its own kind of speech. The girl watched the butterfly win. The wind calmed. Somewhere in the clubhouse, a copy of the policy we had built lay on a printer tray, smudged with the ink of a future that would not need to escalate to illumination every time a rule met a person. The court's words remained in their frame on the clubhouse wall, quiet as law should be, loud only when required. The channel of my life moved back into its banks. Groceries were restocked. The dog snored in a way that vibrated the hardwood. The neighborhood returned to the range of ordinary that contains both kindness and pettiness, trimmed hedges and rogue dandelions. When I took my evening walk, I noticed less and belonged more. The story had started with a notice on a door and a board mistaking preference for principle. It ended with a policy, a precedent, and the small daily miracle of being allowed to live without asking permission to breathe. The last bark did not come from my dog or from any courtroom rhetorical flourish. It came from the quiet itself, from the absence of threats disguised as notices, from the sound of wheels on pavement and sprinklers on timers and a flag that, finally, was lifted by wind alone.